Yeah, and I was very pleased a number of years ago to be invited by the late Brian Tom to speak about the politicians, a number of state and some federal politicians that had an association with Gawler that have served this state and this state in state parliament and also in the Commonwealth Parliament. So that was a pleasure. And then the last time that Sheila and I were with you was last year, I presume, when we went over to St George's Church. Was that May last year? So, and it's great to be back. And it's a fabulous history, the history of the Parliament of South Australia. I could talk for hours, but I'm sure you wouldn't all want to stay for that long, so I won't. But the Legislative Council was first established as an appointed body, so appointed by the Governor of the day in a small building that was on the site of where Old Parliament House is now. And there was lots of controversy about the fact that that building was designed for a small advisory group of 7 people, but eventually had about 25 in this tight little room. Old Parliament House was designed, so what we now call Old Parliament House, was designed in 1851. It wasn't built until 1855 because most of the men had left Adelaide and gone to the goldfields. So it took them a while to get the tradesmen back to be able to build the building. And then, of course, there was the new Act which established the House of Assembly, so the self-government came in, and so 36 members of the House of Assembly were elected in 1857. Those who had been on the old Advisory Council and then the Legislative Council weren't very happy that these newbies were going into the new building and they had to stay in the very small pokey one. But these things happen. I think it was remarkable though that in 1857 we had an elected parliament, at least one house was elected, which was only 21 years after European settlement. I think it's a remarkable achievement for such a young colony. I think it demonstrates the passion that people had for a colony, and most of us here are proud South Australians who are very, very happy to tell our eastern states and Western Australian colleagues that we never had any convicts. We did have a lot of people who were described as dissenters, people who weren't Anglicans or they weren't Catholics, and so they were very proud of the fact that they were coming to a place that had religious freedom, but also had political freedom. And so it took us a long time in this state to develop political parties, and that meant that for quite a long time there were quite a lot of changes in government, because there was a very loose arrangement of people. So premiers didn't often last very long in that spot. In the early 1880s, it was decided that this new building, built in 1855, wasn't big enough, and so at that stage, South Australia. Sorry, Ian, I should have asked you to put those couple of photos up. My fault. So that's the original building, and then there's one of the chamber, I think. That's right. So that's the chamber as it was when it was first built. They then made, and a number of people here have been in there and seen it like that, but there were some alterations to that. They put some windows in that weren't there in the first place, so that they were constantly, because it was never quite good enough, you know. So that covers that first section. So in the 1880s, they decided to build a new building, and at that stage, the economy of South Australia was booming. Wheat, wine, wool, and copper were all sky high. and they got these grand designs, and we'll show you those designs when Ian can get them up. There's two designs. Are they the next ones? Yes. That was one, and that's the one that's closest to what we've got. Obviously, we didn't get that spire. Some might recall a fellow called Peter Lewis wanted to build that going back about 20 years ago, but that'll never happen, thankfully. It's not quite exactly like that, but it's turned out it's pretty close to it. But all didn't go to plan, of course. So they chose a design very similar to that one, and they started building it. And they brought in artisans from southern Europe. My Italian friends will tell me that they were all Italians, but the literature says they were from southern Europe. But they were fabulous people who, I mean, if anybody has been in that House of Assembly chamber, it is a magnificent chamber. And of course they went on building that. But in the course of that construction from the western end, so they started this end towards King William Street. In the course of all of that, wheat, wine, wool and copper all went down the tube, and South Australia was nearly bankrupted by something like that. Now, that is an old photo, but it does show how ornate the place is. It also shows up another problem that I'll talk about later that has been a problem for that chamber, but it meant that they had to stop the building. They couldn't go on because they had almost bankrupted the colony. Yes, so we'll talk about that. One of the problems that they had in that chamber and still have today is that acoustically it's very poor. Because of all of those nooks and crannies up high, the sound went up there and didn't bounce back. And even in the very early days there were great complaints about the fact that people couldn't be heard. Many moons later, when I was there, so it was probably about in the late 2000s, there was an issue in this chamber with some asbestos, and they closed this down for a number of weeks, and so the House of Assembly, 47 members, had to meet in alternate weeks in the Legislative Council. Now, the Legislative Council is only designed for 22, so they were a bit cosy, but they very quickly learnt that the whispers that couldn't be heard in this place could be easily heard in the Legislative Council, because the Legislative Council was always designed to be better acoustically. One of the great features of South Australia and its politics was the fact that we were leaders in women's suffrage. So in the early days of local government, in 1861, women were given the right to vote. There might have been some restrictions on it, I think, but women were given the right to vote. And it was in 1894 that South Australia gave women not only the right to vote, but the right to be elected to Parliament. New Zealand had given women the right to vote the year before in 1893, and apparently the American states of Colorado and Wyoming had also done so at some stage, but they hadn't given women the right to be elected to Parliament. We did. It just took us 65 years to elect any. You don't want to rush these things, do you? And so Joyce Steele was elected to the House of Assembly, and Jessie Cooper were the first two women elected in 1959, and their election was challenged by a couple of old fogies from the Adelaide Club in the Supreme Court. they lost. But our record in women's suffrage is terrific. And last year, Sheila and I, when we were staying in her home city, God's own city as they call it there, of Manchester, we went and visited the Emmeline Pankhurst Museum, which is associated closely with the University of Manchester and the Manchester Royal Infirmary. And we went there because that obviously it has a great commemoration of the suffrage work that was done in Manchester and in other parts of the UK. But it's also, they were very pleased to know more about the Australian connection. And we were way ahead of them. I mean, we were at least 3 decades ahead of giving of the United Kingdom in giving women the right to vote. And even when they first did it, I think they had to be at least 30 to get a vote. And there was some other franchise restrictions as well. Now we can move on with photos because Ian's got some photos that, well, I know there's a couple more here, sorry, that were taken. Well, these are, one's a photograph, and I'm not sure whether the other one might be a photograph of a painting. That's the photograph. I think the other one could be a photograph of a painting. But they give you a picture of so this one was 1890. So that's a very new building. So you've got the old original 1857 and then the new House of Assembly building behind it. The other one, this one, I don't have a date for that, but it's also relatively new. It does show, however, where the building wasn't finished. There's one in Parliament House that actually comes from the other direction that shows the unfinished building to be a real eyesore. And that was one of the motivations eventually to complete the building. It just took them 50 years. Now, people say, why did it take them 50 years to finish that building off? Now, there was World War I, there was a depression. There was also, I think, a lot of the conservative people in Australia, in South Australia, were embarrassed at the extravagance that they saw that caused the colony to almost become bankrupt. And so they were concerned about that. But eventually, in the early 1930s, the Butler government, curiously, that was Sir Richard Butler was the grandfather of the current Federal Health Minister. He's a Labor man. That's the way things work sometimes in families. But they decided that this building should be completed. Eventually they came up with a budget of £250,000 and they didn't have that money, so they went cap in hand to Sir Langdon Bonython, who owned the Advertiser and was a very, very wealthy man. I think the Bonython family would be well known to many in this room for various facets of South Australian society. So Sir Langdon Bonython gave them £100,000 to finish the building off because he had become very embarrassed when he hosted people from other parts of the world and Australia. When he used to take them for lunch at the Adelaide Club, when they came out the front door, they'd look across the road and there was that terrible eyesore. So he was very pleased to provide that money to finish the building off. And as a mark of his donation, I suppose if you're in the two chambers and you're facing where the Speaker sits or where the President sits, the left-hand side above them, which is a media position, has always been reserved for the advertiser as a mark of recognition of that donation. I mean, the advertiser hasn't had anything to do with the Benathans for a very long time, but that is something that has continued until this day. Now, Sir Langdon had a bit of a history of donations and significant donations, which suited him, because in the 20s, early 20s, I think he had been on the Adelaide City Council, and there had been one of the great controversies had been there was a group in the Adelaide City Council that wanted to extend Pulteney Street through to the River Torrens. Now, I don't know why that was controversial, but there was an extraordinary fight about that. Anyway, at some stage the University of Adelaide approached him and said, we want to build this flash hall, and we'd like you to donate the money for it. And he said, I'll donate the money for it as long as you put it right here. So right here, you know where it is? It blocks off Pulteney Street. And because the other thing he made them do was made them build it with a sloping floor, so you couldn't dance on it. Because dancing led to other things. Or some would say other things lead to dancing, but anyway, he has a marvellous portrait in Parliament House, which also marks a recognition that that would never have been completed if he hadn't done that. You might like to move on to your other photos as we go through. These are some photos that that's firstly in the old chamber as it is now. But Ian's taken these on a tour that he's been on with the Gore Museum group, was it? Yes. As I said, it was an amazing thing that they managed to get it built by 1939, because I think if it hadn't been built, with the outbreak of war, I wonder whether it would ever have been completed. And of course it was completed, and there was a brand new Premier of South Australia when it was completed. His name was Thomas Playford. He'd only been in the job a short period of time, and he proposed that the old legislative building be demolished and replaced with gardens. Now, thankfully, and there was a headline at the time which said, Hitler saves the old Parliament building, because they needed a war office in Adelaide. And so the old building became a war office. After the war, it was used by a number of government departments, none of which really wanted to be in there. I think the Public Buildings Department was in there at one stage, and I've had a number of people tell me that they worked in that building as a young person in the public service, but none of those departments wanted to be there. It was sort of neglected. In the late 80s, it was established as a constitutional museum, and they actually had some quite good stuff in there for, I suppose, education, but also information to people. Unfortunately, it didn't get used very much, and so in the early 1990s, when the size of the Parliament had been expanded, the room for members and staff, obviously there was extra staff, and equipment like photocopiers and other things that had to go places. The building, the new building, was bursting at the seams, and so in 1993, the old original Parliament was brought back into the parliamentary precinct and has remained there ever since. I feel a bit homesick when I see that. Almost. It was in probably getting close to 10 years ago that a decision was made that the old chamber needed to be closed, the old building in the chamber needed to be closed for a number of years, and there needed to be a lot of work done to make it a more functional building. But also the biggest problem was that if they hadn't done that work, it was going to fall over. And so it was out of our use for, I'd say, at least 2.5 years, which put a lot of pressure on the other building as far as room for people. But it is back to being a really functional part of the parliamentary precinct these days, and one that I really enjoy the fact that that's been used in that way. I did mention the acoustics of the Legislative Council, and so as Ian's got these photos up, you can see the sloping timber on the side there, and up above probably won't see it, but there are acoustic tiles, so they were particularly put there because of the very poor acoustics in the House of Assembly. And even today, I don't think they would exist in there very well without the PA system. I've probably never had too many problems with being heard in those places, but there are a lot whose voices are a little bit fainter than mine, and they don't carry. It is a fabulous chamber. A couple of things there. While that one's there, there's one of the tapestries there that were brought in 1994 to celebrate the centenary of women's suffrage. And my daughter, Leah, who was in year 12 that year, was one of a group of young women who were asked to bring, nothing to do, because I wasn't in Parliament then, she just was chosen as a young student to take those tapestries in to demonstrate the significance of 100 years, and of course more recently they've celebrated 125 years. The other one is to the left. Yes, to the left of that is the portrait of Joyce Steele, who was the first lady to be a member of the House of Assembly. I'd like to thank Ian very much for assisting me with this, and the fact that he dug up these photos. I have conducted hundreds, I would say, tours. Didn't do a lot in my last 3 years there because of COVID, but I've hosted many service groups, interest groups, schools, all sorts of people have taken around that building, and it's one of the great pleasures of being there. And it's something that, and I know a number of people here have visited Parliament House and had a tour with any number of different groups. But if this organisation wanted to do that, then I think both Paul and Ian would be interested to hear from people that might be wanting to do that, so that we could organise perhaps sometime probably early next year, and you can fit into your program. Have to be a daytime thing, but I still have a number of rights as a retired member that I'll have, and one of those is to host people. I might get one of the current members to assist me, but we'd be delighted to do that if it was something that would interest you, because we could elaborate on a lot of this stuff that I've mentioned this evening. The one that Ian didn't want to talk about, of course, is that in our allowing people, or very much welcoming people to come into Parliament House, it was the fact that Ian played a role in a film he's telling me he didn't want me to say this, but you've got some photos of that, haven't you? while he's finding those, a tour that we do, where one of the gems of the tour, which I'm sure many of you would enjoy, is the Parliamentary Library. And the Parliamentary Library is the oldest library institution, public library institution in South Australia. It has some wonderful books, but lots of other things that actually a lot of other places haven't got. So, and so that we would certainly get the director of the library, Dr. John Westy, I mean, he just absolutely loves showing people around the library. There's lots of things that in that library that you wouldn't see in a normal library, but they are artefacts of history that people have, in some cases, that people have found in a skip, or that have been left on the side of the road. But in many cases, people have just didn't know what to do with something and felt that they needed to be cared for and preserved in a place like that. There are half a dozen books that I came across that were in the possession of my mother and father, that very old books that the library doesn't have a copy of, and so I've given them to a long-term loan, I suppose. If my kids ever want them, they can go and claim them, but I doubt that they will. But so there's some fabulous stuff. Now here we are. You're going to tell us the name of the film?
The movie was called Sting in the Tail.
Sting in the Tail.
But I can't remember that much about it. 1989.
1989.
And
you were the star?
I wish. The lady, I think, was the wife of
You want to come out here?
Gary McDonald.
Oh, okay. Come out here and explain it.
Oh, good grief. I didn't want to be here. 1989, I used to do a little bit of this sort of stuff. And this was a movie made in Parliament House. It took us, I think it was a couple of weeks spent in there. I think I spent about 2 or 3 days. And all I had to do was laugh and abuse her. Gary McDonald's wife, who you know used to be the comedian, whatever he was, I can't remember. He did have another name.
Gunston.
That's him.
And Mother and Son.
That's him. Yeah. So that was his wife. And there was a few other well-known people. I've got a list there. If I can find it, I'll put it up while John carries on. But yeah, it was 1989, I think. So it's just showing that Parliament House was not just for Parliament, but other things did go on as well, and other things still go on.
Is that you here with the beard?
Sorry?
Is that you there on the screen?
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah. I was good looking there. I'll blow it up for you in a tick.
Look, that's just a demonstration, and thanks Ian for that. That's a demonstration that we, in most cases, I think most members of Parliament and the staff are very pleased to show the place off. You are all shareholders in the building. So when I say that, people say, when can I next expect a dividend? Now, some of us would say you get a dividend all the time, but that's probably a hard one to convince people. It does sadden me that we get a number of commentators who really do bemoan our political system and say how terrible politicians are, and to some extent some of my former occupation don't help. But I tell you what, when you have a look at the political systems in most parts of the world, and particularly some that are called democracies, and I mean, look at the American system at the moment, you wouldn't be in any other system in the world. Now, just before I finish, and I'm happy to take a question or two if that's admissible, Mr. Acting Chair, I've had a bit of a look at this book. Now, this is The Life and Times of Old Parliament House. It was written by Pat Stratton, So she was the wife of Hugh Stretton, who was the architect of the Housing Trust largely, and the Stretton Centre down here at Manapara is named after him. She wrote this book. It was produced at the time of the opening of the old Parliament as the Constitutional Museum, but it actually goes through the history of democracy in South Australia very well, and it is a bit irreverent in some cases. It does sort of poke a bit of fun at some of the things that went on, but it was presented by the Premier of the day, who was John Bannon, to the Parliamentary Library, and there's not a lot of copies of them, they tell me. So I've borrowed this, it's in the Parliamentary Library. I would recommend, though, if you are at all interested, I'm sure that Paul and Ian and others can contact me, and we can sort something out if you'd like to do that sometime next year. Yes, Paul?
I'll send an email out to members for expression of interest.
That'd be good. That'd be good. Have we got time for a question or two or not? Yeah, so... Yes,
What's
sir.
the difference between the green seats and the red seats?
Well, the green seats is the lower house, which in the State Parliament's the House of Assembly, where you vote for your local member. So if you're in light, you obviously your local member's Tony Piccolo. There've been probably some in this room that don't live that far from Gawler but don't live in light. You don't have to go very far to be in Schubert. You don't have to go very far to be in a couple of other seats. So, but that's where you have one member for your local area. There was a period of time, probably about 100 years ago, when they changed the system of the lower house, and they had electorates that elected 4 members. And there was one called Barossa that my grandfather came 5th in, so he didn't get elected. It was a bit of a similar system to Tasmania, which here again is a strange form of democracy, but it is democracy. So that's, and then the upper house, Ian, is the one that I was privileged to serve in, so that's the red house, and that's where you elect people from across the whole of South Australia, very similar to the Senate, and so that's proportional representation, so that's where you get representation from some of the smaller parties. Interestingly, the people in this room, when I was first elected in 1997, it was the first time that the Liberal Party had got less than 5. I was lucky enough to be number 4. But on at that election, the Australian Democrats had risen to an all-time high of 3 members. Now, within probably less than 10 years after that, the Australian Democrats had ceased to exist. And in their place in South Australia and other places, the Greens have sort of taken over a fair bit of that space. But just amazing that in that election, the Democrats had reached that top, but then they faded away very quickly. So yes, your member in the lower house is elected every 4 years. Those of us in the upper house are elected. I shouldn't say I'm not there anymore. But those members in the upper house are elected for an 8-year term, so it's half in, half out. Some people think that's a terribly long time to give some a seat in Parliament, but it does mean that you can't chuck the whole place out at once, and I think that's good for continuity. It's probably the one reason why the federal Parliament has never gone to 4-year terms, is they haven't quite been able to get their head around giving senators an 8-year term, which they'd have to do. Otherwise, they'd need to go back to a system of staging the Senate elections and which would mean that go back to some of us would remember when there were Senate elections separate to the House of Representative elections. You know, I was probably fairly young, but I do remember it. I grew up in a political household, of course. My father was, for those that didn't know, my father was in the Legico from 1962 to 1982. So there's been a little bit of politics in our family.
Especially Dawkins Road in Two Wells, named after your great-great-grandfather or something, was it?
Yeah, well, there's also Dawkins Avenue up here at Williston, which goes past the cemetery, of course. Any other questions?
Yeah. John, when we were planning for the renovation of the Civic Centre, a group went down and was shown around Parliament House. I guess what we were looking at is the reuse of an old building, and when you modernise it, leaving bits to show what it was. And there's some really great examples of the old part still being revealed.
Very much so.
But I guess what I'm interested in is the various challenges that the building has had in accommodating the minorities, first women, and perhaps secondly the disabled. Did any of that happen during your time?
Yeah, certainly there were some additional ladies' toilets that were put in the building. Now, I shouldn't smile at this because but there were some complaints because there were certain levels in the building that didn't have a ladies' toilet. Now, I never complained that there were certain levels on my side of the building that didn't have a male toilet, that I had to go downstairs or upstairs. But anyway.
Politics.
Yeah. And certainly on the front of disability access, we had a report from a federal body that told us that we were very naughty people because we didn't have access, and that we were going to have to blow a hole in the front of the building to allow that to happen. In front of the 1939 part, basically. We managed to get around that. So the disability access is in the old building, and then there's additional lifts, and they are lifts that go very short amounts of distance so that every part of the building can be accessed by a wheelchair, and so that's been done. But it's very difficult to what they wanted us to do would have spoilt the look of the building completely. The new car park also underneath the old plaza, underneath where that monstrosity of a building is, that allows also much better access into the building for people that can't walk up the stairs. So there's a lot of improvements, but as you know, with old buildings, if you want to preserve what they are, you can't do some of those things. Now, there's a question over here.
Where did the stone come from to build Parliament House?
Some of it came from West Island, near Victor Harbour, and Granite Island, and some from Kapunda. I'm not sure whether it's in this book, but there's quite a bit of history of that. It's an amazing building. I think, look, it's the Legislative Council, of course, was built on the cheap, I suppose, compared to the House of Assembly, but it's still widely regarded as the nicest upper house chamber in Australia. And the whole building, I think, is, when you go to a number of other parliaments, as I have, I think it's a fabulous building. It has great character. I mean, if anybody's ever been to State Parliament in Sydney, it's a dump of a place, I think. And Western Australia is a very nice building, but they spent a lot of money on modernising the front, the sandstone front of that building, much more recently. So, no, it's a great building. Sorry.
Back in 2000, I was in England. I was visiting my wife's cousin. We went across to Portland, and we sat in a house looking over the Portland quarry, and we're told that a lot of the ballots that come back to South Australia came from that quarry and built the Parliament House in Adelaide.
Well, there could be some of that. Certainly, that was there was quite a bit of that of those things that happened. But I'm not sure about Parliament House. But I might have to have a look at that. If you come on the tour, we'll have to find that one out, won't we?
The reason for it coming back to Australia was they took the grain across to
Yeah,
England.
absolutely.
And they needed something to keep the ship in the water upright on the way back.
Yeah, quite often they did have stuff to bring back, but when they didn't, they needed to do that. Absolutely. Any other questions? Paul?
Yeah, when females got the vote, was that passed unanimously or was that a struggle to get it through? I know, very young male times, you know.
That's why the two things are together. They were going to lose just getting the vote, and it was shenanigans, and they put the vote and the right to stand for Parliament together, thinking that would lose it, and it got through.
It did, yeah, it did. It wasn't unanimous, and there was great opposition initially, but eventually they got it through. And one of the great things was that this was done in 1894. This was done about the time that it was part of that decade or so in which the various colonies were getting together to work out how they would become one country. And there was a lot of disagreement. One of the things, though, that when they finally decided to come together as one country, the fact that South Australia had given women the right to vote and be elected. If the new Commonwealth didn't do that, then obviously they were going to be taking a right away from the women of South Australia. So the whole country, the whole nation went ahead with that, which probably, knowing a couple of the other colonies, wouldn't have happened for some time, I think. So that was a good thing out of that. These things are never easy to get through. We've seen a lot of social change in South Australia, which takes, you have to persist with it. And Ian mentioned the work I did with suicide prevention, but in other areas of social reform, you have to persist, and they had to persist a lot longer in the UK. I mean, that Pankhurst Museum was fabulous to go there and see all the things that went on over a long period of time. Now, a gentleman here has got a question.
As I remember it, initially you couldn't vote for the upper house unless you owned property.
That's right.
And then I think there was a real crisis with it Hall, and that was dropped. That must have been a big issue in your time. I'm just wondering if you could comment on it.
Well, it was before I was in Parliament, but in the period between 1968 and 1970, when Don Dunstan lost power, was out for 2 years, he put up a private member's bill to reform the upper house, and part of that included broadening the franchise for the upper house, because at that stage you had to own land, and in those days most women didn't share the ownership of the house with their husband. It was the husband was the homeowner. So that was one of the things that happened, because the Liberal government supported Dunstan's motion. It was blocked for a while in the upper house. Funny about that. But eventually that was changed, and so the upper house in 1975 changed its election to one that exists today. But yeah, around the world there have been a number of situations where there's been a restricted franchise, particularly to do with ownership of land or age. And in a lot of places, people couldn't vote until they were much older than 21. But that certainly started in the late 60s and early 70s, when it was, and so one of those things was that not only did Don Dunstan initiate that, and it was supported largely by the Liberal Party, but not all. One of the things that Don Dunstan then did was go around very, very quickly and and advocate to get people in a lot of the northern suburb seats and other working class areas, get them on the roll, because that made an impact to the voting for the Legislative Council. So in my father's early days in the Legco, there were 20 members and 16 of them were from the Liberal and Country League. The Labor Party only ever got about 4 members. So that's obviously changed over the years, but it changed with that system. I think I'm getting the message that we're running out of time. No, have we got one more question? Alan Harris, did you have your hand up?
Just a comment on those cobblestone or those ballaststones.
Yes.
The Gipps Cross livestock
Yep.
precinct, all the yards were fitted with those ballaststones for the livestock to stand. It was about 15,000 per acre, and they were sold when the livestock was finished at $1 a stone.
$1 a stone?
Yeah, so $15,000 an acre for the stone.
How many have you got? Ladies and gentlemen, unless there's another question, thank you very much for your attention tonight. It's been a pleasure to come and talk about something that I'm very proud of. I think we're, as I said before, I mean, you can't blame some people for disliking politics and politicians, but when you look at the conflicts in so many parts of the world and the fact that people go to great measures to come to this country because we do have a system, not perfect by any sense, but it's a lot better than most. Winston Churchill always said that Westminster democracy is the worst form of government until you look at all the rest, and then it's the best. Thank you very much.
John stated, he talks about men acting, but you used to do some acting as well, didn't you?
A little bit with the Gawler Centre players and the Two Girls melodrama. I played an amorous priest.
Anyway, you went to Parliament every day, so you had to be a good actor. Anyway, John, thank you very much. I've got something to give you here. There's something for you and Sheila to share. Not all yours.
That's very
A
good.
little something. Thank you. Say thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.